Hearing is now resumed.
Philip Eisvik for the ARE Gillneters Association of BC Fisheries Survival Coalition, for the record. Mr. Goat, there's been a number of days talk about IQs, and then again this morning we spent a lot of time on IQs. And in the IQs in the public commercial troll and seine sectors in Gillnet, can you tell the Commissioner how the lack of IQs in these fisheries can explain how 15 million sockeye have disappeared between Mission and the spawning grounds in the last, since about 1990? Can you tell him how IQs in our fleet cause that problem, the lack of IQs? Obviously, that's a tough question. Maybe I can move on one more time. Then maybe you can tell us, we've had a difficult time in the management of the fishery since about 1990. Can you tell us how IQs in the public commercial fishery would have cured some problem that the public commercial fishery has done since 1990 to put the fishery in the shape that it's in?
Well, in terms of the share-based approach, and we've used ITQs in some of the Fraser River sockeye fisheries, area B and H notably. And what we've seen in those fisheries in particular is a better ability to manage to a specific share of the catch in those fleets.
Excuse me, Mr. Gutt, I didn't ask you what we are talking about the future. I'm asking, what did those fleets do between, say, about 1990 and 2009 to create the problem that this Commission's meeting today? Was there overfishing in the public? Did they not put enough fish to Mission? I'm trying to get specifically what problem in the management of the commercial fleet between 1990 and 2005, the brood year for 2009, can be cured by putting IQs in there? What problem in that fleet?
Well, we're looking at using Pacific Fisheries Reform and the move to a share-based approach to address a number of issues in terms of how the fishery is managed.
I understand you're trying to change how the fisheries managed for the future. I'm trying to understand what problem in the management of the fishery that caused the collapse of Fraser River sockeye could have been cured if there had been IQs between 2005 and 1990.
Well, if you're asking me for well, maybe I can ask you, is your question, are you asking me what role commercial fishing potentially had in the decline of Fraser River sockeye?
Well, that's probably a good place to start. That's the first question.
Well, in terms of that question, there's been a science staff in the department are better placed to explore that hypothesis amongst others that might explain the cause of the decline. Certainly in the in a recent workshop that was chaired by Dr. Randall Peterman and David Marmarick, they did not, the participants at that workshop did not feel that fishing was was a likely cause of the poor return that we saw in 2009, at least in the findings in that workshop.
That's helpful, and it's just a lot of us are thinking that all the time we're spending on IQs kind of distracts us from finding out the real reasons of the decline of Fraser River sockeye. Now, one other question on that, is DFO imposing IQs in the Aboriginal commercial fishery on the Fraser River?
Well, we're working with willing fleets as far as potential different management approaches. So we have not imposed ITQs or IQs on any of our commercial fleets at this point. In terms of a share-based approach, we are managing economic opportunity fisheries, for example, in the Fraser River to a defined share of the commercial total allowable catch, which is specified as a percentage.
Okay, and that's pretty well the same for ARE fleet. ARE's managed to a percentage of the defined TAC, isn't it?
We do have a fleet share specified for ARE as well.
That helps. You talked in your testimony about an experiment that you ran with ARE in 2002, where there was a short fishery that had a catch allocation of 30,000 and caught 45,000. You were quite critical of that. Was there an unexpectedly high number of fish in the river at the time?
Well, the point I was making there was that it's very challenging to control the various different parameters that you might use in setting up a fishery opening, including the numbers of fish that might be in the river.
Forgive me for interrupting the question I'm just asking. Was there an unexpected...
Mr. Commissioner, if the witness could be allowed to answer the question, please. Mr. Eisvik keeps interrupting him while he's answering.
My problem is the question, we have a little time, and I'm trying to get out the answers to the questions that I want. And I'm sorry, Mr. Grout, if I'm interrupting you, and I apologize for that. But
I'd like to resolve this, that if you ask a question, I think the witness is entitled to provide an answer.
Here, the question, I'll repeat my question. Was there an unexpectedly high number of fish in the Fraser River at the time of that experiment? That was my question.
It's possible there was a higher abundance than expected at the time when that fishery occurred.
In 2002, we had a gross escapement over 10 million fish, didn't we?
I'd have to look at the specific data for that year.
I won't bring you to the document because it'll take some time, but it is an exhibit, the 2002 Fraser Panel Report. Now, Jim Woody, in his testimony, said that in 2002 there was a lengthy dispute about how to deal with the early entry of late-run sockeye. He said that DFO was advised by himself and other people in the industry that one way to deal with the problem was to let Area E crop the early entry fish because the vast majority of them would die before they spawned. You were in fisheries management at that time. Do you remember any of those discussions?
Yes, I do.
And why didn't DFO take Mr. Woody's advice?
Well, that was back when we were really coming to grips with the sort of problems we had in terms of early entry of Fraser sockeye into the Fraser River. There's certainly some evidence to suggest that some of these early entry fish may not survive to spawn, but there was no evidence that they were all not going to survive to spawn, for example. So there was a reluctance to undertake a sort of management approach where you would try and harvest all of the fish coming into the river early. There were still concerns at that time about Cultus Lake sockeye, for example.
Yeah, I don't think anybody was saying we should harvest all of the late run, but there was, I think, pretty serious discussions about how long should we keep harvesting those early entry fish, knowing the ones that hit the river the earliest will be the most likely to die, and the ones that come in at the normal time will be the most likely to survive. Can you offer any expansion on what you just said?
Well, I think since that time there's been a considerable amount of work with radio and acoustic tagging to try and further improve the sorts of information that we can get about the timing and migration success of these different salmon.
But at the time in 2002, Mr. Woody's advice was disregarded. We put 10 million fish on the spawning grounds, and there was a considerable loss of economic opportunity for the commercial sector and for Aboriginal groups and for recreational. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's a potential outcome there.
Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, I'll just point out Mr. Eisvik is nearing the completion of his estimate of time. Thank you.
That's good. I only have a couple more things to go over fairly quickly. Mr. Hargreaves, in his testimony last week, he said that, referring to a revival box, properly designed, a revival tank can bring back fish that are, by all intents and purposes, even by the experts, the fishermen themselves, dead. Fishermen rank them as dead. They're in the net, they come aboard, they're dead. You put them in a revival box, and up to 90% of those fish will revive and become fully functional again. In your testimony last week, you said that you didn't ask or have a regulation for Aboriginal fishermen in the river to have revival boxes because there's a cultural practice not to waste salmon that have been killed. Now, I guess if Mr. Hargreaves is right, we don't really know if they're dead or not when they're brought on board. Is that correct? Do you agree with Mr. Hargreaves?
Maybe you could rephrase your question. I thought I heard more than one question there.
Do you agree with Mr. Hargreaves' point that coho coming on board, you don't really know if they're dead? And revival box, even ones that appear to be dead, revival box can revive 90% of them.
I think Mr. Hargreaves is an expert on this matter, and he's done a bunch of the research. Certainly not all of the coho that you bring on board are going to be in a dead sort of condition. A number of them will be still fighting actively. So
of the ones that are dead, Mr. Hargreaves says you can revive 90%. Do you agree with that?
If that was his statement that he's made, I will point out that in the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, we've summarized the information stemming from the selective fishing studies, and we do have a release mortality of 60% that's applied in the gillnet fishery, and can be as low as 40% depending on other factors.
Well, and I'm harping on a point that we've been over a few times, and it's the absence of revival boxes in the Aboriginal fleet when we're in the chum or sockeye fishery, and the absence of a regulation saying throw all fish overboard. You say that Aboriginal fishermen can keep the coho because they're aware which ones are dead and they wouldn't waste fish. And it seems we've got a fisheries practice on a really important bycatch of fish that's based on a cultural factor that I don't know where it comes from. Have you heard any studies about that cultural practice?
Well, you've misrepresented to begin with what I stated, and what I stated last week was that revival boxes are required in the First Nation fishery for the larger vessels over 30 feet. There are also provisions in the Area E license conditions for vessels that are under 30 feet, which allow for different release practices from the revival boxes.
So your testimony here today is that not all vessels in the regular all citizens commercial fleet need revival boxes? Is that what you're saying?
No, it is not. I said, and we can go to the license conditions. I believe we've seen them. There's an exhibit with Area E license conditions, so I'm happy to point you to the spot. But I stand by my earlier testimony that revival boxes are required in the commercial fishery. There are provisions for vessels smaller than 30 feet to have different design or ability to release fish from those boxes.
Well, in your explanation for why Aboriginal fishermen were allowed to keep dead sockeye, you said it was because, and I'll read your words, and one of the reasons there is a cultural practice not to waste salmon that have been killed. Now, Mr. Hargraves illustrates that we can't really tell what's been killed, so a revival box was handy. And I'm wondering, there's a policy or a regulation and a practice on coho, which really serious conservation issue, that appears that you've built it on a cultural practice, and I'm just wondering, what do you have to substantiate that cultural practice you refer to?
This cultural practice has come up in in discussions with the First Nations involved that have requested license conditions to allow for retention of fish that are, the words used, mortally wounded.
And you're probably aware that there's other academic theory out there which say that the cultural practices so far as wasting fish between Aboriginal communities and other communities are probably the same because nobody likes to waste fish?
Yes, I've heard that.
Okay. Those are all my questions. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, Brenda Gertner, and with me, Crystal Reeves, for the First Nations Coalition. I'm going to, as I am wont, start with a little brief story to open this examination. Last week, when I thought I was going to have the opportunity of asking Mr. Grout some questions, I had the crazy coyote arrive on at my office in the morning in the form of Grand Chief Salteri. Now, you've met Grand Chief Salteri as a witness and also up in his homeland in the Statlium at Bridge River. And we had a moment, and I reminded him what we were speaking about that day and the next couple of days. And his comments, and I'm sure he'll say them directly to you if they become relevant, but his comment was, well, that the department is somewhat challenged by their own history when it comes to allocation. And so I asked him what he meant by that. And we only had a few seconds, but he said that having established for decades a fishery that is in the marine, and having industrial fisheries develop, this is all common knowledge, so it's not as if I'm giving evidence, that they've had quite abilities to harvest the fish at quite a long streak, and now the law requires that conservation and FSC fisheries have changed that established fishery, and so that by that way, the department is challenged by their own history. And so that was the story I was going to tell you last week, but I had the weekend to think about it, and I wondered really why it was that Grand Chief Salteri had come and given me, and he gave me the title to these questions. And the title to these questions are Outstanding Business. And Mr. Grout, I want to also start by letting you know that you probably hear this at negotiating tables more often than this type of setting, and it's an important practice that my clients have asked me to use here, and I think it's important, which is that sometimes we have to work the issues hard, but not the people hard. And so we've got some things to do today. You may ask a number of times why I'm asking you these questions. They're not directly from your own personal experience, I don't think, but you're here to talk about allocation on the part of the Department of Fisheries and Ocean. As you know, that's sometimes quite a contentious issue amongst the harvesters of the resource. And there's some history that I need Mr. Commissioner to know about. And I'm going to have to do it through you because you're the witness. So bear with me on some of those and we'll go through them as quickly as we can. And we'll get to where we need to go. And so I'm going to start with Exhibit 264, which is the allocation policy of the departments. And Mr. Commissioner, at page 15 of the allocation policy, Exhibit 264, we begin to get the fundamental principles that guide the Department of Fisheries and Oceans as it relates to fisheries management. And you'll agree with me, Mr. Grout, that we start with conservation, and that's the overall allocation legal responsibility that the minister has under the Fisheries Act. Is that correct?
Yes.
So it's not really a policy per se, it's a legal requirement.
That's correct.
And then we go to Principle 2 on the next page. And again, the second principle that we're talking about here is they call it First Nations, but you describe it as being the food, social, and ceremonial requirements and treaty obligations. And again, you'll agree with me that that's not so much a principle as a legal requirement. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes.
All right. And then the third principle and the fourth principle, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, we go then to the common property resource and then allocations between recreational and commercial. So you're with me on that. That's a policy you're familiar with and you've given some evidence of. Let's start first with conservation. Will you also agree with me that allocations for conservation purposes, and I'm stressing the word allocations there, are becoming more and more sophisticated and perhaps more and more difficult as we begin to implement the wild salmon policy and begin to understand how we're going to allocate for conservation purposes on the Fraser River sockeye salmon and the conservation units. That's definitely outstanding business and a fair bit of challenge going forward. Is that correct?
Well, I have heard from First Nations and others about the methods the department uses to set conservation objectives for Fraser sockeye and the challenges that the groups have in terms of understanding the Fraser River sockeye spawning initiative model and process.
And you'll agree with me, and perhaps this isn't something you're at all familiar with, that as it relates to the implementation of the wild salmon policy, we're clearly at the infancy stage and we haven't got to strategy 4 in any kind of depth where we deal with the socioeconomic issues around conservation. Is that correct?
I think we have some examples of where that's been done, but I certainly expect there'll be more cases of that as well to come in the future.
All right, and then we go next to Principle 2, which is the First Nations legal priorities for FSC and treaty obligations. Will you agree with me that as it relates to the allocation of FSC in practice, many First Nations do not agree with the allocations and do not think that they're adequate and absolutely believe there is more discussions and consultation that's required between DFO and the allocations for FSC?
Yes, I think that's accurate.
And are you aware of any ongoing and immediate processes that would result in consensus on the allocations for the FSC fisheries?
Well, there's a number of ways that a department would go about doing that. Probably some of the specifics are better asked to some of our treaty and Aboriginal policy directorate folks, but certainly treaty negotiations would form part of that. We do work with groups in the Lower Fraser in particular around developing comprehensive fisheries agreements where allocations would be a specific topic of discussion with those groups.
And you're aware that DFO doesn't recognize an Aboriginal, i.e. a Section 35 commercial fishing right unless it's in a treaty or it's been proven in court. Is that correct?
Yes, that is our practice.
And you'll also agree, and we'll go next to Principle 3, and it leads from the FSC priorities, that we're dealing with a fully subscribed commercial fishery.
That's correct.
The limited entry licensing.
Yes.
So it's a little bit of a stretch to think of fisheries as a common property resource in those settings, isn't it? Especially as it relates to the commercial fishery.
Well, it's common property in that the fish in the water are the common property of the people of Canada, and the licenses provided by the minister provide a privilege to harvest those fish.
But it's not up to any individual to be able to easily go and commercially fish. They have to acquire these expensive commercial licenses at this point in time. It's not common property for them to be able to go and fish commercially.
License would be required, yes.
And it's a fully subscribed commercial fishery.
I would say that's accurate.
And so where I'm going, Mr. Grout, and again, I don't think is that in order to reallocate for FSC fisheries, or to allocate for FSC fisheries, or to allocate for First Nations in order to access commercial fisheries, you actually need to reallocate, don't you?
Well, you asked about FSC and then you said commercial. So FSC allocations come before any commercial or recreational allocations that occur. They're first in priority after those. In terms of additional commercial access, it's been the department's approach to transfer access from the existing commercial fishery.
Right, and in fact, so it's a reallocation, or as you said, a transfer. We're probably using different words to say the same thing.
Yes, for commercial access for First Nations.
And if you were actually going to increase the allocation for FSC fisheries, that has to come from somewhere, doesn't it?
That's correct.
And so it would either have to come from the commercial fishery or the recreational fishery. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay, so now I want to take you, if I may, to Exhibit 269. And that's
Sorry, Ms. Gardner, can you give the tab numbers too as well?
Oh, I could try. I've
that.
picked and choose them. Where I'm going to go is Exhibit 264, which is the allocation policy for Pacific salmon, October 1999. I always think I've done well if I've got the exhibit number. Sorry about that. You got it?
Sorry, I only have the tab numbers when I'm looking at
That's
mine,
okay.
so, okay, thanks.
He's got it. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time with this in a couple ways. So let's start with a little bit of history, a little bit of background. This Pacific Fisheries Reform, the 2005, oh, sorry, I've got the wrong document. 2005 document from the department was in response to two reports that they had received. The Joint Task Group report from Pierce McRae and our place at the table from the First Nations panel. Is that correct?
Yes.
And this was the department's response and the way forward from the department's perspective. Is that also correct?
Yes, there was an announcement from the minister and then also a discussion paper at about the same time.
All right, and you'll agree with me that at page 3 of that report, one of your goals from the department's perspective was that First Nations fishing interests be defined and reconciled with the interests of all Canadians.
That's correct, that was part of the vision.
And at page 6 and 7 of the document, and particularly at the bottom or the top of page 7, there's a change, or at least it looks like there's a change in what the federal government is saying there, and you'll see that it says the federal government believes that comprehensive treaties negotiated in the BC Treaty Commission process will ultimately secure the place of First Nations in the fishery. But given the slow pace of treaty negotiations, interim arrangements will be necessary to foster relationships between First Nations and other harvesters that are conducive to the collaborative problem solving and decision making necessary in well-managed fisheries. Right? That was a decision that was reflected here, is that they're not waiting for treaties, so not so much that you've been now instructed to pursue interim arrangements. Is that correct?
Yes, it does say they will be necessary.
And there's a commitment to increasing First Nations access to economic fisheries is a key component of those interim arrangements.
Yes.
And that in fully allocated fisheries, this will require the transfer of license eligibilities or allocations.
That's correct.
All right, so before we deal with a couple of other details, I want to talk briefly about your experiences on the demonstration fisheries and the efforts that have been made to try to reallocate some of the allocation from the marine fisheries into the river, in particular the Fraser River. You're familiar with some of those. demonstration fisheries and things that are going on the Fraser River.
Yes, that's correct.
Do you agree with me that they're learning lots of lessons as we go along?
Yes, I think we've learned more in some years than others, just given the fluctuating abundance and availability of the commercial TAC for Fraser River sockeye.
And one of the things that the department and First Nations are realizing, and this would probably not be rocket science for the First Nations, is that there has to be respect and not competition between the FSC fisheries and any of the commercial fisheries that the Aboriginal fishermen are going to participate in, that's a likely good first principle.
Maybe you could rephrase. I think I missed the question.
In order for a commercial fishery by Aboriginal people on the Fraser River to proceed, that one of the principles will be that there can't be competition with FSC fisheries, but rather respect between the needs for FSC and commercial.
In the department and working with the First Nations that are doing these projects, we've emphasized the need to ensure that FSC harvests are taken care of prior to the commercial fishery occurring.
They also are willingly respecting conservation requirements and are welcoming selective fisheries. Is that correct?
Yes.
They're happily including the desire to refine river stock assessments to address those conservation requirements.
I think there may be additional work required on some of the stock assessment, especially in some of the more terminal areas in some cases.
Clearly there's more work, and that was my next one. There needs to be more information and more time to clearly identify all that will be necessary for an economically viable fishery. That's another thing that's outstanding yet.
Yes, certainly there are a number of things that we would need to continue to work on.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm going to take Mr. Grout briefly to Exhibit 450. They've seen this. You've seen this document before. Are you familiar with the river to plate work that's been going on in the Chehalis and other areas? It's actually all the way up the river.
I have had discussion at not all of the meetings they've had, but at some of the meetings I've been present.
And in this document, they detail a lot of the things that you've just been able to confirm, so I don't need to take you to that, but I'd like you to go to page 10 of the actual document, page 16 in the ringtail, and you'll see just to the bottom of the very last two sentences beside the graph. It's not actually, and I just want to present this statement to you, Mr. Grout. A successful inland commercial fishery will need to be capable of handling a mixture of species and be equally adept at valuing their catch regardless of the species and quality composition. Therefore, allocation planning for experimental commercial fisheries in river would consider a mix of these species in each project. I wonder if you could respond to that, give us your thoughts on that. It's definitely something that they've concluded as a result of the work that they've done on these experimental fisheries.
Well, I think with some of these inland fisheries, and they've been in a number of areas around the Fraser watershed. We've had one for a number of years in the Chehalis Skowlets territory in the Harrison River, which is in the lower river. We've had a project up in the Secwepemc First Nation area in the Thompson, Kamloops Lake area. And then we've had other projects in the Quesnel, Chilco, as well as some of the other areas. I think one of the challenges, particularly for Fraser sockeye, will be differences in abundance from year to year. So there may be stronger years where there's substantial numbers of fish available, followed by off-cycle years where the abundance is much lower. Having access to other species may help from year to year, but pink salmon also returns on odd years, so contemplate even years when there's not going to be pink harvest. And then there's potential for Chinook and chum depending on the area. Chum primarily in the lower Fraser, given that they don't really migrate up through the Fraser Canyon. And Chinook in some areas, depending on whether they can harvest the particular Chinook stocks while avoiding some of our stocks of concern.
So, although we're going to get to this at a principal level, it's a good example of the importance of making sure there's flexibility when looking at the approaches that we're going to use for these types of commercial fisheries, given locations, given the variabilities of abundance, those two alone require flexibility. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes, I think that's accurate in terms of the way the statement's wording here. in terms of a successful inland fishery.
All right, then the next exhibit I'd like to take you to, Mr. Grout, is Exhibit 468, which you were taken to in your evidence earlier. Again, you're going to want the tab.
No, and I'll just try to help. I think it should be tab 29 of the binder.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. And that's a presentation that I believe you were part of or you were at the Ops Committee on defined shares for salmon management.
I wasn't at the discussion at the Ops Committee, but I did assist with some of the information in the presentation.
And I'd like to take you to Ringtail page 14. I've read this chart correctly, but as it relates to Fraser River sockeye and the particular demonstration fisheries that are being reviewed there, we've got a total of about 2.4% of the commercial catch that we're dealing with here. Is that correct?
In this case, and for the particular year, for Fraser River sockeye, it's about 2.4% of the commercial TAC.
And is there any other particular year that it gets higher than that at this point in time, or is that pretty
in
rapid?
2010, which is the year when we had the most substantive demonstration projects, we used the licenses available in the department's inventory, and I believe the share of the commercial sockeye TAC available is about 12 to 13%.
So again, if I was to go back to the outstanding business, we've still got a fair bit of work in transferring any meaningful amount of the sockeye allocation into the river and into the hands of the Aboriginal people. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think 12 to 13% is quite a substantial amount, and some
In
of
a
the
year
groups
like
in the inland-
2010.
Yes.
To be fair, but in the other years, we're about 2.5%.
Well, part of the issue around providing shares was in some of these earlier projects, the First Nations were specifying specific quantums of fish. So these are the percentage share of those. We were in 2010 and moving forward, we've had additional licenses accumulated by the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative, and we're trying to provide all of the share associated with those licenses.
And there are some challenges. There's capacity issues. There's learning how the commercial fishery is going to work, all of the things we've talked about.
That's correct.
It's a work in progress.
Yes.
All right. I just want to ask you a few questions around demonstration fisheries, and then we're going to go to share-based management fisheries. You'll agree with me that it's realistic or reasonable, perhaps, if we want to use it that word, that when you begin a demonstration fishery and you begin to do the work around a demonstration fishery and clean up any of the challenges, that it is likely or intended to move towards a fishery that could be useful in the future and potentially a permanent fishery. Is that correct?
Yes, in terms of the demonstration fishery approach we're taking with First Nations in the BC Interior and Lower Fraser in particular, we've been trying to line up those demonstration fisheries with the business plans that have been submitted as part of the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative.
But it's also thank you, and it's also a reasonable expectation in the commercial fishery that if you're working with them to develop demonstration fisheries and working out the challenges and stuff, that it's likely to end up in a more permanent fishery. Is that correct?
I think there's probably a ways to go before we'd look at making some of these changes permanent, but at the end of the road, that would certainly be something that if we were going to go down that road, we'd be out consulting on the changes that we were contemplating.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner and Mr. Lunn. I'd like you to bring forward the documents we have listed on our list of documents between document number 5 through document number 10. Mr. Grout, these are a series of documents and exchanges between the Council of the Haida Nation, who is one of my client base, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I'm not sure whether or not prior to coming here today you've had a chance to look at these or not. They have been on our list for quite a while. And they're an exchange of correspondence in which the Council of Haida Nation are raising concerns precisely on this issue, on the issue of the use of demonstration fisheries in the North Coast troll fishery. Are you familiar with this issue and the HIDA's concerns?
I wasn't involved directly in the exchange of correspondence here.
Can you speak to any of this correspondence whatsoever?
No, it was before I came into my current role for the most part.
Then I'll ask it generally. Mr. Commissioner, I would like these to be marked exhibits. They are documents that have gone between the HIDA and the Department of Fisheries and Ocean on demonstration fisheries. I suggest they be as a bundle marked as one exhibit because they are all to this topic. I was concerned that whether or not Mr. Grout would be able to answer any questions on these. I'll ask him general questions on them. It is quite likely that if there are representatives from the Council of Haida Nations later in the inquiry that they'll want to speak to this issue. So if we could mark the group as an
Yes, and
exhibit.
Mr. Commissioner, I pause only to see if other council raise any concerns. Certainly the notice was provided with respect to these documents. That's important. We haven't taken a strict view of admissibility of exhibits as might be done in the course of a trial where the witness can necessarily speak to the particular documents. I from a quick review, understand that some of these pertain to the North Coast troll as opposed to South Coast, but I presume the relevance comes in vis-a-vis consideration of demonstration projects and the like. Ms. Garrett is nodding yes. We don't take issue if no participant has a concern.
I'm just wondering which tabs you're seeking to put into evidence.
5 through 10 of my list. Mr. Grout, let's just talk about it more broadly since the specifics are going to be challenging. The concern that First Nations often have, I'm wondering if you've experienced it, is that they're concerned, A, that the demonstration fisheries that are occurring in the commercial fisheries are not fisheries that DFO takes the step of consulting with them on. Can you speak to that?
In terms of the demonstration fishery approach that we're taking, each of the demonstrations has been for 1 year only. We have done some of them again from year to year, but the term of each demonstration is only for a year, and we consult on those through our existing consultation processes, including the ones that we use to develop our integrated fisheries management plan. We do put a summary of the proposals for demonstrations for the commercial area gear fleets, or 8 commercial fleets. Any proposals we have there, as well as our First Nation demonstrations, do go into the integrated fisheries management plan for consultations.
That while they are temporary in nature, through a demonstration fishery, they often lead to more permanent fisheries in place based on the expectations of the commercial fishermen who have invested in them, and based on DFO's ongoing commitment to those commercial fishermen through the demonstration process.
Well, I can speak to the salmon fisheries, and we have not moved to make any of our demonstrations permanent. So they've just been annual demonstrations at this point.
And so if you stopped implementing those experimental fisheries, there would be no concerns and no complaints by the commercial fishermen, and DFO would have clean hands?
No, I don't think I was stating that. Before the department would move to make any of the arrangements we've contemplated under our demonstration fisheries, there would need to be substantial consultation on that move.
And it's fair to say that, for example, for the Haida, that they've seen demonstration fisheries and commercial fisheries in halibut go from demonstration to permanent. Is that correct?
I can't speak to the halibut fishery.
All right.
Mr. Commissioner, I've reviewed the 5 documents that Ms. Gardner seeks to have marked as an exhibit. I'm satisfied that they go in subject to our ability to, I know there's a number of letters, for example, to Paul Sprout, and there may be, I would presume there'll be a document in response that's not been included today.
I think I have them in there.
Well, my quick look, I didn't notice.
I thought I had Paul's response.
So I'm satisfied with these going in subject to our ability to file additional letters that are relevant to these at a later date.
Of course, I have no difficulty with that, and you'll see there is a letter from Paul in here. So I have endeavored to try to give the whole package, and if I haven't, I'm happy to have it. I'm not trying to prove this as directly factually. It's a good example of some of the challenges and concerns around this approach.
Mr. Commissioner, just so we have a record that's clear, what I'd suggest we might do then with Mr. Giles' assistance is work through this list. Tab 5 of, or at least number 5 on Ms. Gardner's letter is a letter to Mr. Sprout. I'm happy to pass the baton to her if she
I can
wants
do
to
that.
walk us through
I'm a
and
little
have
bit
these numbered as exhibits as we go so that they're the
Happy
ones
to.
she's looking to have forward. Thank you.
Happy to. Tab 5 is a letter dated April 12th, 2005 from the Council of Haida Nations to Paul Sprout as the Regional Director General.
I'll mark that as 492.
And then on behalf of the Council of Haida Nations, their legal counsel, Mandel Pinder, and particularly Louise Mandel, writes a letter to the ministers on May 24th, 2005.
As these are related, I'll mark that as 492A.
Department of Fisheries and Oceans I have 2 response letters, one from Paul Sprout dated June 15th, 2005 to the Council of Haida Nations.
492B.
And then June 16th, similarly, it's a response from Paul Sprout to Ms. Mandel of June 16th, 2005.
492C.
Prepared binders or have a list based on her letter to participants. I understand the tab 10 is provided to participants was the enclosure to the letter at tab 5, and I'll just confirm. Thank you.
That's correct. Mr. Register, what exhibit was that? The first exhibit number?
For
The whole of the
four?
bundle? The bundle is exhibit.
492,
Thank you.
A through to F.
All right, my next topic, Mr. Commissioner, is on share-based management. And Mr. Grout, I want to start with just a general conversation with you, and then we'll get into a couple of specifics. ITQs or IVQs are just one form of many forms of selective-based management. And there are things like community development quotas, community-based quotas, all those other different types of share-based management. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe you used the word selective base management, though, at the beginning. So I
share-based.
think you meant share-based.
Share-based, thank you.
Yes.
And this morning we had put into evidence Exhibit 491, which is an article by Parzival Copes that was, in my recollection or reading, was done in about 2004. And at page 2 of that exhibit, I'm going to take you to a paragraph where he's, at the beginning he's doing a fairly general summary of some of the issues. And he begins with, while the above reality seems generally accepted, this is where the agreement ends. There are 2 main contrasting visions of co-management. On the one hand, there are those who view the fishery as a cornerstone of the coastal economy and of coastal life in general, and see co-management as a tool for careful planning. These people will tend to opt for a planned approach to co-management, likely through what is called community-based management. Others who seek market-based approaches to management tend to consider persons who currently hold marketable individual quotas as the legitimate stakeholders in the fishery, in whose interest the fishery should be managed. While the variety and complexity of fishery conditions leaves room for many different options in structuring fisheries management, the most important debate regarding the choice of management systems seems to be associated with the approaches identified above: community-based management and market-based individual transferable quota management. Do you agree with him in a general way that that's a good way of looking at or dividing up the various options under share-based management?
I think that captures some of the discussion. I'm not sure if I agree with all of the points made there. I think co-management is an important element of both approaches.
In the article, he continues on. Are you familiar with this article? Have you spent any time studying the differences through
I don't
these eyes?
believe I've seen this particular article by Mr. Copes.
And Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Coates then goes on to describe the fundamental differences between community-based fisheries management and ITQs. And I'm going to take you to a couple of places. I'm going to go to Ringtail page 5. In particular, in the under the title, A Contrast in Value Systems with Community-Based Management and Individual Transferable quotas attracting so much attention, it's important to understand the key differences. What is good and what is not must be viewed by many angles. So he goes through all of that in that first paragraph. You see that, Mr. Grout? He then goes on to say, first, in exploring the nature of CBM and ITQs, it is of interest to note that in theory, both could be used in the same fishery. This is because CBM is more of a framework for organizing fisheries management at the local level, while ITQs represent a very specific way of dividing up to total allowable catch. I'm going to stop there and ask if you can comment on that.
Well, I'm trying to read quickly here as you ask questions. I understand the ITQ component of this discussion. I'd want to go back and read further though to see what everything that he's including in community-based management. It's not entirely clear to me whether he's just referring to a community-based quota in that case or something that's different.
He is including community-based quotas in the community-based management.
So I'm sorry, could you repeat your question again?
So then I want to know what your views on that are. Mr. Grout, what I'm going to, and maybe I'll just do that, is why is it that the department is only looking at ITQs and are not looking at community-based quotas or any of the broader quotas when looking at reallocating or changing the commercial fishery quotas?
Well, in terms of the demonstration fisheries we've done, we have had some ITQ programs in the commercial fleets, as you note. The demonstrations we've had with First Nations in inland areas have been communal in nature. So the allocation is provided in a license and it can be fished communally. So I think the inland demonstration fisheries are perhaps an example of a communal quota.
Next, as a backdrop to the issue on allocations, I want to take you now to our place at the table, which is document number 11 on our list. Document, if I may, if there's any difficulty with that. It's a large document, and both with this witness and elsewhere through in this inquiry, I'll be going back to that. Mr. Grout, that's the report that went to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans from the First Nations panel prior to the fisheries reform of 2005. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I'm going to now take you first to the executive summary, which begins at ringtail page 3. And I'm just going to ask you to walk through that for a moment, so you get a sense of the types of issues that in this document the First Nations panel is going to. And then I'm going to take you specifically to page 3, where we deal with allocation. And specifically under the title called Allocation Options, you have a paragraph there from the First Nations panel in which they're clearly saying to the department they're not recommending a single approach to allocation because different allocation options may be more appropriate for different species or fisheries or First Nations. A variety of allocation options was considered by First Nations, including community quotas and exclusive fishing areas, fishing using usual and accustomed means without a fixed allocation, fixed allocations, and a percentage share of the allowable catch for a stock. And so the panel was clear, and you've read this document. They clearly look at various different options with respect to allocation and options for allocations going forward, correct?
Yes.
And at the bottom of page 6 in the recommendations, they recommend a moratorium be placed on the further introduction of individual property right regimes such as IFQs, individual fishing quotas, unless First Nations interests, including allocations in those fisheries, are first addressed. Do you agree that that's there?
Yes, I see that.
So why is it, Mr. Grout, that we don't have FSC allocations looked after, we don't have conservation allocations looked after, but it seems important and vital for the department to be moving forward with individual quotas in the commercial fisheries at this time? Why are we doing that first before we look after these other priorities?
Well, you've stated that we haven't taken care of conservation priorities or First Nation food social ceremonial priorities as well. those are or in order of priority, conservation comes first. So we are dealing with the conservation of the resource and providing for food, social, and ceremonial harvests. We've got a clear set of decision rules for Fraser River sockeye, describing how that'll work. I did want to point out that this report was considering all of the fisheries in BC, and it wasn't just directed at Fraser sockeye, for example, but other salmon as well as other marine species. In terms of why we would be considering different ways of reforming the fishery, in terms of the commercial fishery, we think moving to a share-based approach can improve the conservation performance in terms of fishing to specific quantum of harvest. We also think that can assist with achieving food, social, and ceremonial objectives as well.
How, on just that second one, how would it do that? Would it provide for an easier buyback? Is that what we're doing?
In terms of the food, social, and ceremonial fishery, we're ensuring that a portion of the total allowable harvest is provided for food, social, and ceremonial fishery. So the point I was making is, if you have a system where your commercial TAC is less likely to be exceeded, that can help with the performance of your conservation as well as food, social, and ceremonial objectives.
One of the concerns that First Nations have around the movement to ITQs in advance of at least their comfort zone around FSC is that, as you know, it creates a more privatized, proprietary interest in the license holder, and therefore a more expensive, potentially more valuable license. You'll agree with me on that that's a concern the department is aware of?
I would agree that that concern has been raised, but certainly looking at the evidence on values of licenses in salmon fisheries, that certainly hasn't been something we've seen. And I can say specifically there, using the Area F troll fishery as an example, the license values have declined from 2005 to 2009. There's a report on the department's website called the West Coast Fishing Fleet, which is an analysis of commercial licenses, quota, and vessels by Nelson Brothers Fisheries. And in the Area F troll fishery, the value of the licenses have declined despite the introduction of an ITQ demonstration fishery there. And I think that's primarily been driven by reduction in the total allowable commercial harvest of Chinook.
So is it, I may have not have gotten that correct, so it's more the quota values that are become valuable as distinct from the actual license, is that
in terms of salmon demonstration fisheries, there isn't a separate or permanent quota associated with the license. In terms of the annual license document that's provided to harvesters, the change has been on the Chinook in the Area F from a no limit on the license conditions to a fractional share of the commercial TAC. That license is a privilege that's provided on an annual basis. So the value I'm referring to is the license value.
And so is it your evidence that the department has fully grasped and have dealt with the potential problem associated with reallocating from the commercial fishery into the Aboriginal fishery and the potential of increased costs in the buybacks?
I think we've heard that concern, and at this point we're just doing the demonstration fisheries on a temporary basis for 1 year at a time. We have not allowed permanent reallocations of quota that have crossed over on years.
And what is the department's anticipation in terms of timing on the increased use of ITQs in the commercial fishery? As it relates to Fraser River sockeye.
As I provided information previously, we don't have a fixed deadline or target for when that might occur.
And so you're open to waiting until all these other matters are addressed?
Certainly that's a possibility that can be considered here.
Have you made any commitments with respect to that to First Nations?
In terms of waiting until Sorry, maybe you could...
Until their issues as it relates to the allocations for conservation and the allocations for FSC and the movement to increase their commercial, the percentage of commercial catches. Are you going to wait until those priority issues are addressed before you move forward with ITQs in the commercial fishery?
Sorry, you asked a number of points in that question. Maybe you could repeat the ones.
Sure. So, as you know, I've gone through a couple of the priority obligations that you have both in law and in principle, which are the conservation issues and the FSC issues. And we've talked about those. There's outstanding business as it relates to both of those. Now we've moved to what you're doing in demonstration fisheries in the commercial fishery. And I've raised with you, and you've confirmed that First Nations have raised concerns with the department about moving too quickly as it relates to those and have not yet addressed the priority allocations. Are you prepared to commit on behalf of the department that you will not be moving forward as it relates to ITQs until those matters are addressed?
No, I'm not prepared to make that commitment.
Mr. Commissioner, I'd just like to clarify the record that Mr. Grout can only speak, he can't speak on behalf of the entire DFO. He can only speak with respect to his position and the knowledge he has with respect to DFO's policies.
Absolutely. I want to, if I may, go to document 14 and 15 on our list, and I've just got a couple of things left to finish up.
Ms. Gardner, I'm sorry,
Wish to mark number
what?
11.
Yes, please.
what are we marking, Mr.?
That'll be, item number 11
Our place at the table, the
Oh,
document
right.
I
I
handed
was
you,
just gonna
Mr.
ask.
Commissioner.
is 493.
490, thank you.
Mr. Grout, when you were here last week, you gave a little bit of evidence on DFO's vision for shared stewardship and as it relates to allocations. And I just have two more areas I want to ask questions about. And one is in particular, I'm not sure if this got into evidence last week. I don't believe so. It's the presentation that was provided by the Department of Fisheries on stability, transparency, and predictability and allocations in November of 2010. You're familiar with that document?
Yes, I have seen it before.
And were you present at the meeting in which this was presented to the First Nations Fisheries Council in November of last year?
No, I was not.
But you are aware of this document and the presentations that DFO has given to First Nations based on this?
The document and the consultations were developed by our national staff in Ottawa.
I'm wondering if I could have this marked as exhibit. Again, it's been on our list of documents and council are familiar with it.
494.
Mr. Commissioner, I'll take Mr. Grout again now to exhibit number 15. I expect you may not know this document if you weren't familiar with the first one, but I'll try. I have to let you know that the document listed in our tab 15 appears to be a document dated January 27th, 2010. That is incorrect. My client advises that date is incorrect, and if we need to have that viva voce, I'm sure somebody with the FNFC will be giving evidence later. That's a document in response to the November 26th presentation. The correct date is November 27th, 2011.
That's impossible.
Because this is the 2011, November 27th.
Aren't we in 2011?
Yeah, but it's.
January 27th. Thank you. January 27th, 2011 is the correct date of that document. Thank you.
Sorry, not the date that's on the document.
That's right. I'm going to come back to Hoppy. The document is dated January 27th, 2010. You know, that wonderful difficulty in January to make sure that we've got the right years. That's what we're seeing there.
Thank you.
That's all. And it's response of the First Nations Fisheries Council to the November 26th document. And Mr. Grout, I'm going to take you particularly to the last paragraph on the first page. where the First Nations Fisheries Council advises the department about how important it would be to have more comprehensive discussions that to take place through workshops or discussions that would engage First Nations more broadly in these discussions and allow for proper analysis and feedback. You'll agree with me that that's what the First Nations Fisheries Council has advised the Deputy Minister as of January 27th, 2011, regarding any changes in allocation issues.
That looks like what it's stated there.
Finally, and I asked for leave of other council on Friday, Mr. Commissioner, I have 2 more documents I'd like to bring to your attention. And I appreciate they're as it relates to the halibut fishery, but they're definitely on ITQs. And I understand from council that there aren't any difficulties with me now introducing these documents. The first is an announcement by the minister. Where's the minister's announcement? And the second is a letter in response to the minister as it relates to ITQs and Pacific halibut fishery. And if I could have those marked as the next exhibit.
496.
Mr. Grout, given that they're halibut, I'm not expecting that you'll have any direct knowledge of this, but I want to raise with you and have you respond to the concern that's being raised by the First Nations Summit, in this case, directly with the minister in response to the recent announcement on halibut ITQs, which is that in their view, the divvying up of the spoils between the commercial and sports fisheries interests prior to the AFS priorities being addressed fails to meet DFO's legal obligations. And I'd like you to respond to that as it relates to the Fraser River sockeye.
Well, I did have a chance to look briefly at the document here, and I maybe would note that there are 2 fact sheets and a questions and answers sheet that were also associated with the one document on the statement by the minister. The department does continue to be committed to meeting food, social, and ceremonial obligations before providing for access to a commercial total allowable catch, and that's consistent with how we manage salmon as well as other species.
I'm just having difficulty, and I know my clients do, and so I wonder if you could help us, that if you continue to improve and provide proprietary-like interests at ITQ levels in the fisheries prior to the reallocations occurring, that is going to create a more expensive or more difficult reallocation for the Department of Fisheries. Do you respond to that?
Well, I'll answer the question this way. When we issue a license for one of our commercial demonstration fisheries, prior to that, and maybe, is there an exhibit with the Area B license conditions that I could refer to here?
Mr. Commissioner, I believe there is. I think we put in area conditions for Area B, should be Exhibit 476, number 49, Mr. Grout, in your binder, and number 49 on the list of exhibits for 2010-2011.
I stated it in words earlier, but I thought it might be helpful on, so it's on page 3 of this exhibit. You can see, under the number 1, species of fish that are permitted to be taken. So this is a license that was issued for an ITQ fishery for Fraser sockeye, but you can see at 1A for Chinook salmon, no limit, chum salmon, no limit, coho and pink, no limit, and skipping to F is sockeye salmon in Area 23, which is Somas sockeye, no limit. The department's managing the fisheries with no limit to a commercial total allowable catch, and we're doing that by setting the open time, and any vessel that chooses to participate in that opening can harvest salmon in essentially no limit on the quantity until the fishery is closed. Conversely, where we have a demonstration with an ITQ, what we're doing is providing an opportunity to harvest the same quantum of fish but in a different fashion. In this case, we're specifying at E for sockeye salmon accepting in the SOMAS, which would be Fraser Sockeye on this license, 0.28698% of the TAC. So this is an annual license issued for the year, and it provides a share of the TAC. In both cases, before and after we did the demonstration, we were using this to manage to the same commercial total allowable catch that was available. We're just using two different ways to do that. I'm not sure what the date was on this license, but I think it's up on page 1 at the top. This covers the period April 1st to March 31st, 2011.
And so if the decision was made to go from demonstrations to a fleet-wide ITQ, where would that decision be made?
Sorry, are you referring to a specific time frame for that, or?
Yeah, where in DFO, at what level of your decision-making process is decisions around time frames for introducing ITQs in the Fraser River Sockeye and the approach as to whether or not it's going to be fleet-wide? Where in that decision-making process is that decision going to be made?
I would expect that the briefing on that sort of decision, given that it's likely to be controversial, would most likely be required at the ministerial level.
And so that would require a briefing from the RDG in the province here to the minister?
Yes.
Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, Ms. Gardner entered into evidence at Exhibit 496, a news release with respect to a ministerial briefing note or a statement by Gail Shea, Minister of Fisheries. I'm wondering if that should also be entered into evidence.
I think it is part of the package already, no?
I wasn't clear if both documents were part of that exhibit.
Yeah.
They are. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, just to look ahead, we need to finish at 4 o'clock. Mr. Grote has a commitment as well. We're on track to do that. I wonder if I might request a 10-minute break as opposed to 15 for us to do that. Thank you.
Hearing no recess for 10 minutes.